Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Bob the Bookerer, and today I wanted to speak about a book that I covered briefly in a weekly wrap-up, but is a book that has just come out called The Voids, and it's by Ryan O'Connor. And this is a book that I was really kind of sort of trying to work out how I might feel about it before I started. And I know that's always a fool's game because you can never quite predict this, and most of the time you're wrong. But I sort of thought this might be a book that I would quite enjoy, but didn't necessarily have too much of an expectation going in, and I was really delighted by how much I really enjoyed this. As I sort of covered a little bit in my weekly wrap-up when I mentioned it, this book is a sort of story set in Scotland, particularly looking at the Voids, which are it's a sort of tower block that's been condemned, and all the people who live in it are basically from sorry, I'm getting a lot of glare on my glasses, are people who are in marginalised communities. And so we kind of have this character that we're sort of introduced to right at the beginning, who is sort of struggling kind of the after effects of trauma from his family and sort of various other things, and is really trying to battle how he works through everything. And that feels like a very easy sort of that's the sort of story that we maybe heard a bit before. It might sound like that at first, the sort of, somebody struggling with drugs and alcohol, trying to make things work, kind of a little bit Train Spotting like, in the sense of losing sense of reality. But I think this book does really new and exciting things that I just found really beautiful, and I wanted to talk about that. It's published by Scribe UK, and they are really quite fun for sort of publishing books that are a little bit off the beaten track. So I've mentioned Prosopagnosia, which I read as an advanced copy earlier this year. Last year it was also Fathoms, The World in the Whale. So quite a broad range of books that are sort of quite interesting, and this book fits in quite nicely alongside that, in terms of just sort of being something that really quite surprised me. I thought it was such an interesting book, and I wanted to talk a bit more about it. I will eventually be going on to spoilers, but this first bit is going to be spoiler free, and then I'll announce when I'm about to go into spoiler territory. So as I mentioned, we are introduced to this character who is trying to process reality and where he is in the world following sort of family trauma. And we learn quite early on that a lot of this trauma is about his father, who left him, and particularly the way his father left him, which was sort of saying he was going to come back and then never quite doing so, and lots of other sort of complicated things in their history where he and his father don't really sort of understand each other or seem to trust each other. And this sounds like an incredibly bleak thing, and yes, a lot of this book is quite brutal and quite bleak, and we follow the character through quite a lot of hardships. To name a few, sort of drugs and alcohol, the character being sort of essentially homeless or whatever for a while. When they are back in the house, this tower block, this is a condemned space that's meant to be destroyed soon, and so there's this sort of complete lack of home, really, that there is this place that could be called home, but it's going to be destroyed soon. And what do you do in those circumstances? What do you do when that's all about to be taken away from you? And what I thought was then really clever about where this book goes next is really moving you through this character sort of losing a bit of track of reality and then sort of trying to come back. They have various things where they are trying to argue for their right to exist. There's a scene where they are trying to eke out an existence and find a way of having enough money or having a house, a roof over their head to be able to survive, but also at the same time a large amount of what appears really to be self-sabotage. This character just seeming to get somewhere and just seeming to be a little bit more stable, and then something going wrong, or them doing something that lands them back in the same place. And again, that sounds incredibly bleak, but I think what's really well observed about this book is how actually, for people who are trapped in some of these cycles, it's incredibly difficult to get out. It's not just a case of make some good decisions and everything will be fine, partly because the good decisions are few and far between, and those same good decisions can also be things that you need certain resources to be able to access, or actually the better decision in that moment is the one that's going to keep you alive but isn't going to be useful long term. And so we see this sort of character fall further and further through the cracks. And, you know, this is not a self-pitying character in many ways. This character has quite a lot of agency, has quite a lot of strength, but you can also see is trapped in some of these situations, and also freely admits that they have made some of their own mistakes that are kind of landing them where they are. But this gets increasingly beautiful and powerful once we start really exploring the relationship with his parents, and particularly with his father. And we get a few sort of sequences of looking back over their relationship and really understanding what had happened between the two of them. And here I'm about to go into a few mini spoilers, but so, you know, please be warned. But these are not sort of too major, and so I mean, I still urge you to check out the book itself. But I think it's worth noting that some of this might, you know, some of these may be revealed more in the book, and you might not necessarily want to do that. So you have been warned, and the curtain is sort of dropping. The spoiler curtain is dropping. So moving on to some of those spoilers, we learn a little bit about how he and his father sort of came to be sort of separated from each other, or came to have this difficulty in their relationship. And here is where I think this book really starts stepping up into gear, because we see how the father himself has also been through quite a lot, and his own lack of grip on reality leads to him making decisions that are not great, and his own circumstances also lead to those sorts of decisions. Again, this is not to justify his decisions. We are made, I think, in the book to understand that his father's decisions were terrible in many ways, but equally we are sort of, I think, what I really appreciate about this book is its generosity. We are on one hand able to see that this character makes terrible decisions, and his father does as well, but also understand that this is not mostly out of malice. You know, his father makes some decisions out of some weird kind of confusion, but there's also a lot of shame and fear and everything else baked into it. And I think that's something that's really beautiful about this book, is its generosity of understanding, in really looking at how this came to pass. And so he and his father, we sort of recount, we learn a little bit more. And, you know, our main character spends most of the book being convinced that his father is dead, or his father's sort of long gone and he'll never see him again. And so that makes sort of little moments of reunion even stranger, because this is unexpected. This is not particularly where the character sees the book going. And also his sense of reality is so warped that we also, a little bit as a reader, at least I did, sort of questioned whether this was actually happening and whether he wasn't just talking to a random person and assuming they were his father. And I think that's, again, sort of something so clever. At the heart of this book is we are watching as this character loses track of reality and loses sense of reality, but the book is told through such startlingly clear language. You know, it's not a sort of stream of consciousness thing where we are kind of wrapped up in these complicated thoughts with the character. What's actually really clever about it is the character is so reflective and so perceptive in so many ways, and that sometimes makes it even more heartbreaking, because it's not that this person is completely sort of lost to these thoughts, but actually they have these moments of lucidity and clarity where they understand exactly what's going on and can really feel sort of a sense of empathy or sympathy for other people around them, but are still almost doomed to make the same mistakes and repeat those same errors again and again. And it's heartbreaking as a book, but that clarity of writing is so beautiful throughout, and I think was one of my absolute favourite things about it. And as this book goes even further, and as we sort of go through, and it's a relatively short book, I should say, but as this book goes further and further, that clarity of thought becomes even more biting, because we watch as people around this character are completely unable to really see into what is happening, which means we're even more reliant on the thoughts of the narrator himself. And where those start to lose track of, you know, lose sense of reality, makes that even more heartbreaking. And the end of this book, again, without spoiling what actually happens in it, and I mentioned this in my weekly wrap up about it, I was hovering around 4 and 5 stars for most of this book. I thought it was really beautifully done. I was really loving what was happening. but couldn't always necessarily, you know, there were a couple of little bits I wasn't fully connecting with, but was still very much along for the ride. But I was sort of, I finished the book and was absolutely convinced that it had to be 5 stars, partly because of this final section of the book. And I mentioned it in the weekly wrap up, but for me, there was something about the last sort of 10, 15 or so pages that was so startlingly clear in its vision. But where I think this book then really steps up is that clarity in that final 10 to 15 pages suddenly manages to find a way of summing up the book and wrapping up parts. And it's not going to be neat and it's not going to be tidy because we know about this character's life. But there's something very tidy about the way the book actually wraps it up that actually makes it incredibly powerful, I think, for me. I read the last sort of 10 to 15 pages in this sort of, I was on a bus as well, which it was this really dramatic moment actually. Well, I say dramatic, it's a, you know, but it was a sort of, you know, I had about 10 minutes until I was getting home on this bus, and it was the final like 10 or so minutes basically of the book, and they coincided nicely. Like I finished the final page and then like 30 seconds later I was getting off the bus, which, you know, is pretty, it sounds pretty dull and unexciting, but for me, that's the kind of life I live, living on the edge like that. All jokes aside, that final stretch, these sort of 10 or 15 pages, managed to wrap up the book in a way that was not cliched for me or over-egged or anything like that, but instead was just startlingly lucid, as if the character suddenly sort of broke their chains a bit and suddenly could see everything for what it was, could sort of come to their own conclusions and wrap things up. And it isn't neat and it isn't tidy, but is full of understanding and knows where it's going next. And I have not read an ending to a book like that in a very long time. And it wasn't through it being twisty. It wasn't, you know, a big dramatic twist at the end or a big moment that was sort of like an oh my gosh moment or whatever. Instead, it was just this really clear, lucid bit of writing that just got to the absolute point of what this book was all about, and was full of love and warmth and cleverness and perception and all of these other things. And I absolutely loved it. So this is a book I really want to see do well this year. I want to see it sort of being picked up. I really think it will. I hope it will. It's the kind of book that I think really sort of surprises you for what it can do, because it is on the surface it sounds like a story that we've maybe heard quite a lot, you know, the story of somebody facing addiction or struggling with family issues, and it does so in a way that is so new and refreshing, I think, just for how clever and well handled this is. This feels like a very confident and mature book, and I'm delighted that I had a chance to read it, partly thanks to an advance copy, well, all thanks to an advance copy from Scribe UK and from NetGalley. And I really hope that you enjoy it if you do check it out, if it sounds like a book that might be of interest to you. If there are other books that you think are similar, I'd love to hear about it. But, you know, I really do hope we can give this book some love this year. And I've been Bob the Booker. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.